Okay. Last stretch of our presentation. Thank you all for sticking with us. It's the afternoon. It's the end of the day. We appreciate it. And the last piece that I'm going to talk a little bit about is ethical storytelling. This could be a whole long training in itself. I am going to try to do a crash course in about 10 minutes or less. So apologies in advance. But part of the reason I'm going to try to keep it short is that we know there's expertise and experience in the room. And we're really curious to hear from some of you about like how this lands and what your experience has been with sharing your story. So I'm going to start with a focus on principles kind of from an organizational standpoint, right? For folks who are working at organizations who might want to partner with someone you work with to share a story. And then we'll talk a bit about what we've heard from folks with lived experience about that side of it, and we'll open it up for discussion. So it's just some key principles, and we've learned this. We've been doing a storytelling initiative together with organizations around the region for a couple years now, and we've done, quite a bit of digging and research and talking to folks. So these principles are kind of coming out of all of that. First of all, process really matters as much as the product, as much of as the end product of the story. And it's really about building trust and building relationships with storytellers. Take your time and know that it's worth the wait. Sometimes, to do this right, it can take time and be labor intensive, but it's worth that. And to kind of sync up your strategy with your organizational values, make sure your process reflects your values. Getting consent is really important, including over time, because stories change as people change over time, right? And someone may share their story with you, and then a couple of years later be, less comfortable having it out there. So ask for permission, including over time. It's great to have a written agreement about consent and how an organization might share an individual's story. That might not always be feasible, but the more you can have really clear agreement and informed consent is important. It's also, be real that there are potential risks and think through risks. So if someone, especially if they're sharing a really traumatic or a vulnerable experience, if we're putting that online, it could be out there for years, right? And it could be, that person might be looking for an apartment, looking for a job later, and if somebody Googles them, it's going to show up. Like, think that through. Be mindful of that and be upfront about that. Have that conversation with your storyteller. Help them think that through, and that can help decide or determine, what to share. And you don't really need to get into all those details a lot of the time, right? And also just have real caution and sensitivity. If someone is currently in a traumatic or vulnerable situation, asking them to share about what they're going through right then brings up a host of issues, right? And that might just not be the right time, not be the right person at the right time. Again, because it's hard to give full informed consent when you're like in the midst of a really tough situation. Compensation is really important. Compensate folks for their time, for their expertise, for the risk that they're taking on. Different organizations have different budgets. There's no like golden rule of how much is enough, but if it's valuable to your organization, you should show that by compensating the storyteller, just as you would if you were hiring a contractor or a part-time employee or something like that. And there are non-monetary ways to compensate people that can be meaningful as well, but it ought to be more than a meal, right? So, we've had interesting ideas about somebody, saying, maybe you give people like a spa day or like, give them like a makeover, or, if that would help people feel comfortable. Or we had somebody was worried about seniors we were talking about who were worried about privacy and identity theft, letting people into their house. And it's like, there's ways to avoid that, but also you could give folks like some kind of security information or something like that. So anyway, there's ways to get creative about that. Can I ask you to write down your question? We're going to have time in just a couple of slides. A couple more key principles, just that training, support, giving folks time and space to like practice and think through their story, using simple prompts, or also just you can orient folks with key messages or talking points, but not as a script, right? As just as a guide. That can be really helpful if folks are open to that. But it shouldn't feel like putting words into folks' mouths. It should be something supportive that's helpful to them if folks are open to that. And also just using, so asset framing is kind of a term of art, but it's just defining folks by their contributions, by their assets, by their aspirations, and not by their challenges, right? And again, you don't have to focus on the hardest parts of somebody's life or the most difficult parts of somebody's story to have an impactful story, and emphasizing a person's agency in their own story, not just that like my organization came and helped this person, but actually it was, it's all about them and their agency. And again, just being aware of power dynamics, making sure feel comfortable saying, no, thank you, I don't want to do this, or setting boundaries about, hey, I'm not going to share about this, but I'll talk about that. And, naming power dynamics that are there, acknowledging what's there. And, it can get tricky if folks feel like beholden to, someone who's housing them or an organization that has helped them. And just be aware of those dynamics and try to make sure. Again, I think that goes back to trust and relationship building. So again, that's kind of from the organizational standpoint. Oops. Oh, I think I get it. No, that went back to the beginning. Hang on. Slideshow. I don't know what I clicked. Thank you. Okay. So again, from an organizational standpoint, it's more about curating what makes sense to share than censoring what a person can share, right? So somebody's story is their story, but there might be just a part of that that is strategic to tell and that makes sense to share given your goals, your audience, what you're trying to do with the story. So especially as long as you're in communication with the storyteller, they understand your goals and your audience and what you're trying to do. That certainly helps a lot. But there is that kind of sweet spot that overlaps between the full story and what my audience needs to hear and feel. Katie, can you save your question or is it burning? Yeah. Yeah, I hear you. Katie's pointing out that a lot of the folks that are left in the room are folks with lived experience and maybe not so much the target audience. So I'm seeing you. I see it. So I'm rushing through and I'm going to move on and then we're going to hear from you all. So here's a little bit about what we've heard works and what hasn't worked from folks with lived experience sharing their story. And maybe rather than reading this slide, I'm curious if it resonates, and we'd love to hear from some folks about your experience. If you have shared your personal story, again, and some of these kind of speak back to those best practices, but having space again to practice and having some training and support having sensitivity to not being re-traumatized or not having to share like your darkest, hardest moments, having agency and being involved in how your story is shared and shaping it. And then we've heard a lot about some really tough experiences about what didn't work, what didn't feel good to folks. And we know there's a huge potential and risk of harm in sharing stories. So lack of, what'd you say?
I guess I get a chance to talk after.
Okay, I guess maybe you'll have something to share. That's okay. So yeah, lack of preparation, not having the context of how is this going to be shared? Why do you need it? What are you doing with it? Having again to like rehash traumatic stories, especially if it's in a way that feels exploitative or transactional, or people feeling tokenistic, or so. I'm curious how that lands with folks. So you had a question before, and now you get your chance. And I could come to you next if you want to share. And I would just ask, we have about 20 minutes left for our whole presentation. We want to have general Q&A as well. So maybe 5-10 minutes of this, but yeah, all good.
So it's kind of a two-part thing. The first thing I was going to mention when you were talking about the compensation, and it's something that I've said probably in this room several times, but I'll just reiterate it because it's something that happens so often. Is that when we are in the position that we have the ability to pay folks, please remember that we get told all the time how to live our lives, how to do this and then the other, that we can't do this or we don't know how to handle this. One of the biggest stigmas is that we don't know how to manage our money. And as from personal experience, there's nothing that's more infuriating than being told, oh yeah, we're going to compensate you, and then finding out, oh yeah, it's like a $5 McDonald's card, which is fine. I'm not saying anything against McDonald's, but also just remember that like that happens a lot, and it's sort of belittling. On the topic of the storytelling, something you said that really stood out to me was that like the context and like constantly checking in with folks, and specifically there was a reporter that reached out to me, and wanted to talk about one of the shelters that I had stayed in. I won't name names because I'm just going to be polite right now, but in the context of the story, we were talking about how like there had been this really terrible tragedy that had happened in this place, and what was my experience with the staff and how could this have happened, da 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 da. And then months later the story finally came out and the point of the story had changed. So there was a quote in it where I'd said something about who cares if the residents are smoking in their rooms, and it sounded terrible because at that point the story was about the state of the shelter. But when it was actually said, it was in context to like there had been a dead body found. So like in the scope of things, who cares about this? There's this happening. So just making sure that we continue to have those check-ins and conversations.
That's a great point. Media training, talking to reporters is like a whole other thing. And I wonder, were you just on your own and they asked you, or was there an organization that you're connected to through that? How'd you get connected with that reporter?
So the funny thing is this reporter is actually like one of our good reporters. And when this happened and I read the story, I was like, oh my God, I can't believe it. I can't believe this is happening. So immediately I texted them and I was like, hey, just, what's up with this? This is not how I meant this. And this is how it looks. And this is like, could be potentially damaging for our entire like movement right now. Like what happened? And I was like, can you issue a retraction? Can you say something? And she was like, actually, normally I would have checked in with you first. That's usually my practice. My apologies, something felt whatever, da 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 da, and we can't really do anything about it. And so it was just kind of a lesson for me as well. But again, to be fair, this person really is usually a very, on their, but even just that one mistake can be Yeah.
It can be really tough. Yeah. And I mean, we could come back and do a media spokesperson training if that would be helpful to folks, if folks find themselves in that position, because it's especially tough with the media where you don't have that long-term relationship. It sounds like you were pretty savvy and you did know the reporter and you know that you could call and ask for a retraction. Good job. Nice try. But yeah, it's tough when your comments get taken out of context, and that's happened to me as well. It's a bad feeling. Did you want to share?
Well, I told myself that I wasn't going to share today, but you asked me to, so I don't want to disappoint anybody. First of all, I like what you said about some of the reporters. They need a lot of training. I read an article in which one of the reporters who reports on homelessness actually stated that she got the tiny homes confused with the tough sheds, also known as rough sheds. Now you can't confuse the two because the tiny homes, the bathroom, the 2-burner stove, and the tough sheds, also known as the rough sheds, doghouse, tool shed. Now, if you're going to report on homelessness, you need to know the difference because I mean, it's like apples and oranges. You can't confuse those two.
What was your experience?
Well, I need to reach out to her and let her know you made a grave mistake because you're confusing people. The tiny homes, they're tiny homes. And it's a step up for the people who are experiencing homelessness. And the tough sheds is totally different.
That's where you wanted to share?
Well, no, that's not, I didn't even got there yet. I'm almost there. Oh, no, I'm going to get the story. I like when you said storytelling. I'm not going to say anything. I told myself I was going to keep my mouth shut today, Edie, and then you made me talk. So my experience is people with, first of all, I'd like to say lived experience. We have a lot of valuable information. And I was speaking to, I believe was it Katie today? Yeah, I'm thinking. And some people need to go on field trips to see what's really going on out there. Right, Katie? They need to go on field trips to see what's really going on. Before these people get, awards and all this stuff like that. You need to know what's really going on. Talk to people with lived experience. They can tell you what's really going on. I'm going to really pay attention to the ethical storytelling, and I'm going to pass the mic on because I don't even want to get started. I'm going to just leave it there because I had the village help me today to keep my mouth shut, so I'm going to just pass it back.
All right.
How'd I do, Patrick?
Anybody else want to maybe share an experience that you had sharing your story, whether it was positive or negative? You have something to share?
So being on both sides of the fence, being a service provider, and then also with lived experience, sometimes it's hard to differentiate that, and those blurred lines get crossed. When I tell the stories of my clients, I have to get the release of information and tell them, look, I'm gonna talk about your situation to such and such or to a reporter or whatever. They're like, yeah, no problem, go for it, because they don't want to talk. A lot of times they don't have the words to say, so I talk for them. When I'm sharing my experience, I am totally open and transparent. You can ask me anything. I'll tell you exactly how it was out there, what it was like, and all the struggle and the breakthroughs and the victories. And I consider my homeless journey I'm grateful and I feel blessed for it because it walked me into my purpose. Of all the struggle and everything that went through it and all the trauma. And when I go back out there as a service provider, my people that I live with and my friends and my clients now, I experience that I get re-traumatized, I get triggered. And I keep that in context that that's going to happen, and they're still in living an experience, and I'm not. That's the only difference. But it's always storytelling is so important to do, and it's so important for communities and to hear about the stories and to understand, because you're not going to understand if you don't understand and you don't get personalized into someone's situation. How are you going to empathize with them and empathize with the situation and want to help? You're just going to be like, that's another statistic. It's not. It's a real person. Here's a real story. And so be direct, and when you're telling other people's stories as a service provider or whoever else, just make sure that you get their consent and make sure that you get the facts straight and speak clearly to the reporter, whoever you're speaking to, so you can convey the message and get that out there to people.
Thank you. Indeed. And you wanted to add something?
Quick. I also just want to point out there is a huge importance of telling your own story. And that's something that places like, Poor Magazine, Street Spirit, Street Sheet, so on and so forth, they offer that opportunity, and they do compensate you for your stories, and they do offer those, classes on how to like tell your own story. There's nothing more empowering than being at the helm of your own ship.
Nice, nice. Yeah, and hopefully what we've talked about today might help give you some ideas for how to do that, right? How to go out there and share your own story. I want to just open it up to general questions because we got about 10 minutes left in our time. If folks have other experiences with storytelling, oh yeah, should we do let's show the QR code? No, I forgot a step. Okay, we have a little QR code with some resources for you. Our Begins with Home narrative playbook, which is like great messaging ideas and more information about crafting a message or a narrative. We have a messaging guide about how to talk about homelessness. There's also a QR code for that, I think, floating around here, but it's on this link tree. And then we have a digital toolkit for sharing some of the video stories that we've produced. I see you. I'm going to call on you first. And those things are all at this link with this QR code. So with that, I think you can now ask us anything. Do you want to range about and see the people? I'm tired. I'm going to stay up here.
Okay, I gotta get my steps in. But I didn't see who had their hand up over here. Okay.
Right there.
Hold on,
At the beginning of the slides, when it talked about the two organizations, there was an acronym NPH. I wanted to know what it stood for.
Okay, so the question is, what does NPH stand for?
Oh.
I can answer that question. That's a really easy one to start off with. Thank you. Stands for the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California. NPH is an organization of nonprofit affordable housing developers and folks who build permanent supportive housing. Sure. Next.
Jonathan, you going to catch Jonathan?
I don't know why I walked all the way back there.
Back.
Yeah, I'm getting my steps.
Thank you both. I have two questions. Well, one is kind of a challenge to us, but the first is a question. I really appreciate this kind of distinction between like data doesn't change minds, stories do. But I also feel like there's something problematic about that to me, because the stories I hear from every person that ever calls me for every news article is 24 billion, 24 billion, 24 billion. And so it is that number embedded in the narrative of the governor put out 24 billion. We don't see it. And it's like, well, let me tell you how many housing projects that take 10 years to build that 24 million is wrapped up in. So I guess I'm just kind of asking that question of like, clearly data infects minds or becomes these mental hooks for people that does inform the story in a lot of ways, or it sort of defines the framework. And so how do we like reckon with the intersection of that versus kind of the dichotomy of it? So that's the question. And then the other one's more of a question for us.
Do you want to ask the question for us first?
The other one, yeah, okay, sorry. The other one is like, this is a challenge to us as like and so I'm going to speak as a county person and a former provider, former advocate, speaking to my advocate partners. How do we do the work of telling the truth to power and governments without collapsing into the very problematic narratives of the government doesn't work, the government doesn't know how to spend money, don't fund the government, that the right is, I'm sorry, I'm going to make it political, that like the bad faith critiques of the homelessness, because the bad faith critiques of the homeless system are pulling those same tropes, right? Like I have seen the most progressive, I won't name them, but the most progressive of politicians that I've worked with in the East Bay have shared the same dog whistle articles that are put out by, the press that are quite literally trying to understand the whole what's happening with those taxpayer dollars kind of articles, which undercuts the whole opportunity for like, so I wonder how we as advocates and like critique can do that without playing into the narrative we all don't want, which is you can't trust public dollars, the industrial complex is fundamentally broken. Like, so it's just a challenge to us. Like we need to have that conversation because sometimes I think our well-meaning advocacy plays into like global distrust in a way where everyone loses.
Mm-hmm.
Really good points. I think on the first one, I want to say, so you're commenting on data people don't make decisions by data. It would be great if we did. I think there's two sides of this. It would be great if human beings made more decisions by like some kind of truth. And we also live in a moment where that is so not true, right? In our media spaces, in our politics, like we are needing to navigate a reality where there are whole segments and groups in our society who are actually invested in not believing true things. So that is tough because we have some truth to share. And if people heard that truth, we think they would agree with us, and that would be simple. But that's not the world we live in. And humans, we all make choices about the world or what we believe about the world based on how we feel. So it's more like that's how we start. That's how we get in front of people, and that's how we move people from where they are, is helping them feel. And often we do that in a similar way to trying to kind of jump over the cynicism that you're describing too. Because yeah, we know, I mean, I think we have anybody working in this space, and I'm hearing it in the room, like we all have our own kinds of cynicism we feel. How could we not when we see or have experienced what we've seen or experienced? But cynicism doesn't beat cynicism. And nor does trying to just speak to our opponents. Right? Remember the slides we showed, 73% of folks who are surveyed in the Bay Area say they believe having a decent place to live is a basic human right. 60% want to see more housing built in their neighborhoods. Again, that's like not the reality that we hold based on what we see, who comes to community meetings, what reporters are writing about. So we have to remember that there are groups that we can reach and speak to and activate and inspire and turn out who aren't being activated, inspired, or turned out right now. And that's generally what we try to stress to focus on is what are the stories we have to tell? How can they be powerful and reach people? And to focus on that work. I would love to tell you that we can change what reporters are talking about. But maybe one piece of good news, and we'll go on to other questions there, is one of the other things that, like when we ask people what they think about affordable housing, right? One of the questions, one of the options people could have chosen is if people could have said that they think affordable housing is too expensive, which I think would be a very reasonable thing for a lot of people to believe based on how much the
Too
media
expensive
is
to build?
focused.
Too expensive to build?
Too expensive to build, yeah. Sorry. It's also too expensive because of AMI and all the things. Okay. But actually people didn't think that. So something about like, yeah, that's what our opponents are really focused on. It's what the media is focused on because that's what they're getting kind of pushed to by our well-funded opposition and all of their media work. But it's kind of not core to most people's thoughts about what affordable housing is. So that's great. That's a good news for us.
Yeah. I would just add a little bit in response to your questions, Jonathan. I mean, it sounds like that $24 billion figure has transcended becoming a statistic and is like a story. It's become a story, right? And so there may be, it's not like you can't say a number, right? Or you're not allowed to have a fact, right? But I think making that part of a story, like what's your story number, right? Like how much of that does Alameda County actually get? And compare that to what it would actually take to turn the problem around in a meaningful way or something, right? And so it sounds like, you can kind of complicate that number with stories. You can show them why it's not as simple as it sounds. I think it's a little dangerous to start being like, $24 billion just isn't enough and we just need more because, then we're still in that frame of everything being too expensive and nothing working. So I think also the thing to do is to show what is working, right? To remind people how important that funding is, what it's doing, show examples, and just like double down on success stories, on what's working. And, it's a tough environment though. So.
Okay, so there's a question here. There were some questions maybe were there, so we'll get that one.
I just have a very quick comment from the perspective of some of my colleagues on Zoom. I think it's important to say that stories are data. They're qualitative data, and they're just as important as quantitative data.
Amen.
Yes. Okay, I saw some here.
You know, I'm always going to bring it up because I never hear it being brought up. So I'm speaking from two perspectives, lived experience and now working with the county. And that lived experience led to me working with the county, participating in the committees and the leadership programs, EBHO, Everyone Home, the whole nine. I want to bring up the fact that we are now on the same playing field as everyone else, meaning the media doesn't have the technology that we don't have. We have AI, they have AI. We have computers, they have computers. We have smartphones. These phones, the technology, we didn't see this technology 25 years ago. We now have it in the palm of our hand. Just to give you some insight, I started my podcast 10 years ago. 10 years ago, there's a podcast. Everybody's, tripping out about what is a podcast. So it's a radio show, but it's connected to the internet. Everybody has access to your information. Flash forward 5 years ago, I got grandfathered into Spotify, so that gave me the 10-year bump. But I want to push for folks, even regular folks, if you haven't used AI, you should. And it's all about the questions that you ask with your stories. I challenge you to tell your story to an AI chatbot. You don't have to use your names, but tell your story and see what the output is like. It's going to blow you away. And then you ask those questions that you want to ask about the public. How much money is being spent? Where'd that money go to? So now you have data that's going to be pulled into your stories, and just experiment with it. Because what I've gotten over the past 2.5 years, I resolved homelessness 2.5 years ago. let's just say that I resolved it. I've just been in rooms where it wasn't being accepted and there was all this fear. And I say fear and faith can't live in the same body. You either have one or the other. So if we have the technology, use it. It's free, and it's been free for a long time. I think it's going to continue to be free. But I say use it to not only to actually polish your stories, polish up your stories. There's now a technology Google has where you can actually tell Google your story, and it'll take the discussion and put it amongst two people. You can't tell the difference if John and Ron is in the room, but it's discussing your story in a way that no one else could have told that story but you. So that's the individualism that artificial intelligence. I wish they'd just take the artificial off and just call it intelligence, because we created it as human beings, and it starts with us in the first place.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you.
I think, I want to point out, Patrick's got a good point that this is a lot easier than it used to be and that it could be, right? And it's, you saw our videos, some of them were really simple. And, they don't all have to be like high production value, little short films. But we do have a, powerful computer in most of our pockets that can, so I would also just urge folks, and we got to wrap up, but to keep it, to just like dive in and try stuff, right? To Patrick's point.
Yeah. And just to
okay,
lift up one other thing you said is, right, fear and faith don't live in the same body, I think you said. Right. And I think about that a lot as fear and hope, very similar. Faith in the future, hope for the future. Right. If we have to be careful how we tell stories, just in a general way too, of not spreading more fear. There is enough fear out there. And so one of our challenges is to talk about what we see, how bad it is, in a way that can still make people feel hopeful. Part of that is by having people see it as part of a system, see how it can work, what can we scale up, what can we do more of. We have time for one more question. And
I mean, don't threaten me with a good time. I'm going to try to wrap it up. You know, Ms. Shelley always has an opinion. I think there are several things happening that always happen. First, we're exhausted telling you what to do already. We lived experience really feels tasked with the responsibility to tell the truth based on what we went through. If we have the luxury of being on both sides of the desk, we get to talk about the systems and the structure and the failure of it in our experiences. We get to tell you what we went through, how we persevered and survived it. So we're giving the perspectives, we're not beholden to any politics. We're not beholden to anyone. We're giving you truth and fact, and we're saying, we're trying to tell a story that is going to actually get us closer to the goal. We never say, we don't say end homelessness. We impact it, we reduce it, we remedy it, we change, the foundation of not having anything and do prevention as the foundation versus find housing as the prevention. But if we are going to keep going around in circles about, what do you think about the homeless epidemic? Oh, nobody care about that shit. We know about it already. What we care about is, what do you think about the new contracts coming in? Should they dedicate units? What do you think about the new building coming up downtown? You guys who have a responsibility to the narrative have to use that language. We can keep telling you, you can keep exhausting us in every committee and in every interview where we have to go back and say, oh, that's sine, cosine, none of that, but okay, we're exhausted. We know the answers, Sway. We got the answers. And it is a matter of whether or not the decision makers want to do something with that. But if you're not going to adjust the language, we can't push that issue. We can only give you the guide. We could say, hey, shaping policy is a lot more helpful than having to riot. Shaping policy and being in the space feels a lot better than having to be on the other end where we have to, our leverage is physical, our leverage is noisy. We'd rather our leverage be a part of the process and development. Because surprise,
Amen.
surprise,
Amen.
we can do a thing together if the collective collaboration is that equity we talk about, if there's a willingness to do that. So that's where Ms. Shelley is.
What a perfect,
I think that's it.
yeah, what a perfect note to end
We're a little
on.
over time. That's it.
Can I just say one other
You
thing?
get the last
Just
word. You
one
get
thing.
the last word, right?
Okay, I just want to know, can we come?
All right, let's hand it over to Chris. Thank you all so much.
Yeah,
for
thank
your
you.
time.